Okay.
All
We are
right.
here with Miss Courtenay Turner.
Hello.
Hey, how are you?
I am well, thank you. Great to be here.
It's always great to talk to you. You're always such a joy to talk to.
Thank you. I love
I
talking to you too.
I don't you make all this bad news seem like tolerable.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I, yeah, I
So
really appreciate that. It is. I think it's important to talk about even the dark stuff. So,
yeah. Well, and it seems like that's all we talk about sometimes. I try to mix in something every once in a while where it's like, let's not be so serious today. Let's just have a conversation and chill out for a minute.
mm,
So
I don't do that
because
too often, but
I think podcasts, when I was over the road, I noticed that there was I was taking in so much media and so
mm,
much information constantly because I didn't have anybody with me. It was me and my dog,
right.
and it was 12-hour days, and I'm just pumping information in my head all the time. And it made me miserable. It was like I'm
Oh,
not an
really?
I'm like a really even kill kind of chill person,
Yeah,
and I
totally.
started feeling anxiety.
Oh,
And it's
no.
like, if it can do that to me, imagine what all this media, just this constant cycle does to people.
That's really fascinating. I find it doesn't do that for me. I think I'm a very curious person, and the not knowing makes me more anxious. So, like, a lot of people like to just read headlines and they just to have a sense of what's going on, but for me, knowing a little bit without diving into it, that actually makes me more anxious. So,
Mm,
but when I can understand something and I know the roots of it, that it alleviates some of that anxiety for me. I think it also makes me feel somewhat empowered, like knowledge is power. But the other component of it is that I think knowing the dark, when you start diving into the dark, like, it is spiritual warfare, right? It's a spiritual battle. And if
mm,
there's that much dark, then it makes me hopeful there must be that much light.
right.
I think that so much of the light is just has been dimmed, and it, hasn't been turned on, for, lack of a better metaphor, right? And
Mm,
I think that if we share the knowledge and we uncover some of the dark, then hopefully that can flip some of those light switches on. It only takes one candle to drown out the darkness, right?
right.
There's this phrase, I say it all the time, but I always add my own tagline onto it. It's from the book None Dare Call It Conspiracy. And they say it was one of the last lines of the book. And it says that, conspiracy can only survive in the dark. So I always add on to that. And therefore, it's incumbent on the light to be shown on it to expose it.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think, at least from a man's point of view, uh, especially my perspective, it's like let's say I'm having a conversation with my wife, right? And
Mhm.
she's telling me about a problem that she's dealing with.
Right.
My instinct is to fix it.
Right.
And
Right.
so I see the problem and then I realize there's no solution
Yeah.
like that I can like put forward. That in itself causes me stress.
I can see that.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
So,
It is really interesting, the trucker. So my fiance was trucking for a while, and, we listened to so much, and he said that he would go around, to all the different stations and talk to people, and he said they're some of the most awake people because I guess they spend a lot of time listening to radio, podcasts, audiobooks, and, he said it was really fascinating how much when you go through the country, and it's kind of, encouraging to see that they are so awake. It
mm,
shows that there are people who actually know what's going on and care. So
right, right.
that's
Yeah.
the silver lining of that. But yeah,
Yeah, truckers get a bad rap for being stupid, and there are plenty of stupid truckers out there. Don't get me wrong, but there are a lot of very intelligent truckers.
yeah,
One of my best friends, Gord McGill. I
hmm,
mean, he writes on the trucking industry and all
okay,
the regulations. He started his own podcast called The Voice of Gord, where
hmm,
he talks to people that have been researching the trucking industry. Because if you look at if you look at the kind of panopticon system and the
hmm,
surveillance system that is going around and being introduced to the public,
right,
truckers have been living under that already.
Yeah.
And so we kind of have like this insight through ELDs that of how you're going to be tracked and traced.
Right.
And
Right.
so he started writing articles for Newsweek and started his own podcast, and he's
Oh, wow.
doing well. Yeah,
Oh, that's awesome.
he's
I'll have
making
to
a
check
lot of
that
extra
out.
money doing that. Yeah.
Oh, very cool. Yeah. No, there's definitely a lot of really smart truckers. I've definitely met several of them. Obviously, I think my fiance is quite brilliant, but yeah. And he really is. But
Oh, I believe it.
yeah. And but I've been on a podcast for he's a trucker as well. He's a Canadian trucker, super super smart guy. Yeah, I've known you, like I know a lot of really smart truckers. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's definitely kind of a misnomer, but
Yep. Yep. But we're here to talk about 15-minute cities, not
yeah.
about truckers. Um,
15-minute
we'll have
cities.
we'll
Well,
have to we'll
definitely it's going to affect truckers. So,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
So, definitely a good segue. But,
So I saw what was it, about a month ago, I saw that Saudi Arabia had released this
mhm,
video talking about what they were doing in the 15-minute city
mhm,
kind of outline, and the way they advertised it, and they were advertising it more like a tourist destination,
mhm.
that in which virtual reality, digital reality, and physical reality all intermingle.
Yeah,
Now
that's
I can kind of see the and they plan on rolling this out in 2050, they said. So they're going to be building it, and it'll be prepared, like completely prepared by
mhm,
2050. So I was looking at it, I was like, okay, so all the plans I've heard for these types of things are like 2030. For some reason, Saudi Arabia is pushing it back. Maybe we have a little bit more time than we initially thought we had in how these things are going to be rolled out and affect our lives.
mhm.
And by advertising it as a tourist destination, it almost seems like a beta test.
Yeah. Well, that is their MO, the beta testing. So as far as the 2050, I think that they're trying to implement as much as possible by 2030, but 2050 is when that's like there was 20 agenda 2130/30.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like they have phases. And I think the next phase is this agenda 2030 to agenda 2050. So it's the next 20-year. The first one was a 9-year, but then a 20-year kind of. They might do something in between. I mean, that I just don't know. But we hear a lot about Agenda 2030 and then Agenda. We haven't heard it's not called Agenda, but the whole 2050 plan. And one of the big plans in 2050 is the complete dissolution of nation states. So they talk about like there will be remnants of power blocks, but there won't be actual nation states anymore. And I think the 15-minute cities will be the insular structures, but no longer, at least that's their goal. There won't be, actual sovereign states anymore, which is quite scary. But the tourist destination, I think, is definitely a beta test. It's definitely a way, but I don't think it's just a beta test. I think it's also they like to lure people in under the guise of convenience, trendiness, fun. I always use the examples of social media, and I use the example of Facebook versus LifeLog a lot. I just think it really exemplifies this so well because LifeLog got taken down 2000 in February 4th, 2004, and then Facebook went up February 4th, 2004. And LifeLog was a DARPA project that collects all your data and had like this basically a running list of all of the data on each person.
Right.
And we basically Google has like something like 80,000 pages, whether you use it or not, on everyone. So it's not like this went away, but this was an official project from our intelligence military complex agencies, and they had deemed it was a violation of Fourth Amendment, and so they took it down. But then I can't prove that Facebook replaced it, but it did go back. It went up February 4th, 2004. So the exact same day that they took down LifeLog. And it was tied with a lot of the same players, the whole social network, Winklevoss and Zuckerberg story. It was a great story, but it's not quite what happened. And So if anybody wants any evidence, or to research this further, they should look into the Leader Inc. Lawsuit that is still ongoing, as far as I know. And that was between Leader Inc., which is Michael McKibben, and the government and Facebook. They're suing him. They're suing Facebook, sorry, and they're suing the government. And it's tied in with In-Q-Tel. A lot of the, In-Q-Tel is still very much affiliated with Facebook today. So all this to say, what was the big difference between Facebook and LifeLog? The biggest difference was that LifeLog was a forced top-down type of mechanism to track people and record, collect the data. And Facebook is an opt-in system. This will be so fun for everyone. You get to share all your photos of your family and your kids and your pets, and know where people went to eat dinner, and where they went on vacation, and see all their beach pictures. And it's just so fun. But you opt into it. And that's the big difference, I think. And this is the Luciferian model too. I think when you look at it from a spiritual warfare perspective, they both sides want to be chosen. I think that's the whole Genesis story, right? God gave free will, so because he wants you to choose him. And I think the same goes for whatever, Lucifer or Satan, but it's the notion that it can't be forced upon you. You have to choose that. And then once you do, you're trapped into it. So that's usually what happens. Once you choose, then, it's kind of like the injections. Like once you chose that, you can argue that the force was pretty strong. There was definitely a lot of coercion and incentivization that was pretty strong, but people still chose to do it. Once you choose, you're in that system, right? Now you have to show your papers. Now you have whatever effects were caused by it. So, that's just one example, but it's still an opt-in system. And I think the same goes for these 15-minute cities. They're going to make it enticing for people. It's super convenient. You have everything at your fingertips within 15-minute radius. And it's a destination spot. The first 15-minute city, actually, the beta test for it, I think, was Disney World. It was really like a 15-minute city layout. Everything you could possibly want is right in that, little epicenter. And I think that was really the beta test. So it shows you how far back these plans go.
You brought up the idea of these things being Luciferian, and the thing that popped in the thing that popped into my head was that Cain was the inventor of the city from the story of Cain and Abel,
right?
And I've heard, I think it was Father Turbo Qualls talk about cities having the spirit of Cain that still resides within them, the resentment, the bitterness, the undervalue of human life. And so when I talk to people about ESG, I always call cities like a corral where they move the cattle into this corral, and they just try to keep you there. And people are like, well, what if I don't want to leave the cities? I don't want to be a part of all these things, but I don't want to leave the cities. And I'm like, man, I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to sit here and say you're a bad person because you don't want to leave the cities.
Right.
But you're addicted to the passions that the city fulfills.
Yes.
Right. And so that addiction is holding you hostage.
Yes.
And so that's what they're intending to do with these 15-minute cities, is make everything so convenient.
Yes.
It seems so natural and so fun that you are then enslaved to the passions that the city fulfills.
Yes. And I think that's been their model. We can go back to like the British East Indian Company back in the, what was that? The 1600s. And that was all predicated on creating a consumeristic model where people were addicted. Now, granted, the drugs back then were more like coffee, tea, although there was opiates, right? And then they created the insurance companies to be a protective mechanism for the drug cartel, because that's essentially what it was. And I think that that model is very much what they continue to replicate today. They create these addictions. And, we see it with the smartphones. It's like people can't live without them. And they created this, the planned obsolescence and all these things that are centered around it because they've made you addicted to it. And I think that's exactly right with the 15-minute cities. They're trapping you by all of these supposed luxuries and conveniences that you need. But really, what are cities? I think cities, just not even 15-minute cities, but the cities themselves, I think were designed, one, to propagate the lie of overpopulation, because when you're living on top of each other, you have the illusion that we are overpopulated. But if you go over most of the world, you'll see lots of farmland, lots of just unused land, and people who are very far spaced apart. And that you'll realize that this notion of overpopulation is actually really not true. It is true in the cities, absolutely. People are overpopulated and congested. I think they're also designed to track, stack, and pack, right? So really, it's to create this, you cram people in like sardines, and now you have limited resources, and limited resources are a mechanism for control and control grids, because people become more desperate when you're under limited resources and finite resources. And the the packing them in like sardines, gives them the illusion of being overpopulated. But then it's also really to create this surveillance state. And the 15-minute cities, I think, are the next iteration of that. They're just the next step up of this tracking surveillance mechanism. And we're seeing all these, the blue light cameras that are going up. I think, a lot of people have seen them and are kind of curious, what is that? But those are full on tracking and surveillance devices. We don't know. There's a lot of speculation about how they interface with people, but we know at the very least they definitely are, increasing the cameras, and that those blue lights have the technology in them to read luciferase. So, of course, the theories have been that there's been some sort of, we know there's luciferase in the injections. So, there's, of course, the theory that it's a way of tracking who has taken it and who hasn't.
Right.
That hasn't been 100% proven at this point. So I'm not saying that that's fact, but there's certainly evidence to indicate that, and those facts are true. The fact that can read luciferase, and the fact that luciferase is in the injection. So those two things are true. And
Well, there's
mm,
also the point that so many people put their private information out so
yes,
openly on social media, right? So they don't even need to really trace whether or not you have this substance within your blood system. All they have to do is match your face identity to your social
mhm,
media, and you've probably told everybody how you feel about this stuff, and so
yeah.
they already know.
But now they have all that information, and they can track you in real time.
Mm,
You're in these a small parameter, and the big component of all of this too is the geofencing. And we have now in the I believe it's the infrastructure bill, they put that no cars built made after 2026 uh, can be made without having this basically kill switch
mhm.
where they can be shut off at any time. And certainly that's a geofencing mechanism where if they track you and you go outside the confines of these 15-minute cities, they can shut off your car. So you're trapped essentially. They can shut off your car, they can shut off your phone, and
Yep.
if they push out these CBDCs, they can completely shut off your wallet and any spending power, at least through that mechanism. So that's really another track and trace device.
I think they would be able to do that anyway because of the chip cards now. They all have the chips in them, you know, that you have to
Yes,
use.
to some
I
degree.
I could see them being able to, like, shut that off if they really wanted to.
Yeah, they could shut off your credit card. Um,
Well, I'm just
but
talking about debit cards. See, so we have voluntarily I remember, what was it, 10 years ago, Glenn Beck was throwing a big fit because or Obama wanted to introduce a cashless system like India has, and he
Mhm.
was like, "No, you can't go away from cash. Blah blah blah. This is terrible. Blah 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 blah
Yeah.
blah." And then they introduced like this chip card and the swipe. Like all you got to do is wave it in front of the machine, and
Right.
it automatically takes it out of your account. And it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, everybody voluntarily went cashless.
Yes. And that's what they do. They want you to opt in. They make it
Right.
super, they advertise it as it's convenient, it's cool, it's trendy,
Hmm.
it's fun, and that's how they get you enticed. They entice you, and then people volunteer. They don't force you. That's I think, a misconception. People think that they're forced. They use coercion,
They
and
use
they're
propaganda,
definitely
they use
yes.
coercion. Yeah, but look how easily that people just go along to get along, right?
Yeah.
It's a very like we're a different breed of person that are this like dug in to these
Mhm.
topics so that
Right.
we know how to put up our defenses against them. Most people don't spend their time researching this stuff.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
I always
And so they
I'm
are
always so surprised when people don't know these things, but yeah.
but most people are just going through their day-to-day life. And like when I was driving over the road and I was kind of like away from society, like
Yeah.
my entire world revolved around this information and other
Mm,
podcasters. That was
right.
all my communication. But when I came locally and I
Mhm.
started working locally and being in a store at times and dealing
Yeah.
with customers and managers and cashiers and all these other people, I started
Yeah.
realizing like these people don't have a clue. They don't know. Their whole life revolves around I go to work, I
Right.
make my money, I take care of my family, I go to bed, I get up, I go to work.
Right.
On my days off, I mow the yard, I run errands, I work on my truck, I do this, I do, and it's like it has nothing to do with the type of stuff that you and I talk about on a regular basis.
Right. Well, I think that's why it's really important to share this with, whoever, and plant seeds with people who may not be super versed. One of the things I'd like to point people to is the UK, because they're rolling out, and they've rolled them out in many places. And for anybody who thinks that we are totally safe, like if you're in a red state, you are not safe. Uh, I live in Tennessee. There are many places in Tennessee that you would not expect that you think of it as like a red state. There are many places here that have these 15-minute cities already. So it is really cropping up everywhere. But in the UK, they're doing it under the guise of being a climate lockdown. So it's
Mhm.
really under the guise that you're saving the planet. And of course, Klaus Schwab talked about that in his COVID-19 Great Reset book. So
Yeah.
um they've had these plans in the works for a long time, and they are advertising it as you're being a good human, you're saving the planet. And people who don't know that uh the climate narrative is essentially a hoax, and it was created by the Club of Rome in 1972 in the Limits of Growth. In their 1992 document, the Global Reformation document, they admitted that it was a complete lie and that it was designed to be propaganda, that they needed to come up with a common enemy of man, because if there was a common enemy, then people would rally around it, and then people would fight against it, and they would grab onto this, they knew was a lie. And they decided the enemy of humanity was man, of course.
Yeah.
So that is the carbon they want to reduce. It's you. So yeah, so that's how they're selling it to a lot of people, that it's a way of saving the planet and saving the environment. And a lot of people are bought into that narrative, so of course they think they're being a good person by doing this, and they use the whole virtuous and the moral kind of ingratiation to get people on board.
Well, you brought up that Tennessee is doing a lot of stuff, and this is what brought up this
Yeah.
topic actually in my mind, and why I wanted to get you on is because uh, Steve Fox, who's a mutual friend of ours, and
Mhm.
he's Fox and Sons Coffee is a
Yeah,
sponsor of both of our shows.
it's
He
awesome.
he noticed that the mayor of Cleveland was like like basically coming out and advocating for Cleveland being turned into a 15-minute city.
Yeah.
And he was like, wait a second, what's going on here? Like, will you do a show about this? Because I don't know what's happening here.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of talking in
Mhm.
we're kind of talking around the details.
Mhm.
And can you shine some light? Because the way I look at a 15-minute city is it's going to be like almost like the metaverse. It's going to
Mhm.
be it's
Yep.
going to be kind of like a fantasy.
Yeah.
It's almost going to be a sci-fi movie in reality, and it's going to feel a lot like you brought up Disney World earlier. It's going to feel like that. It's going to feel like an
Yeah.
amusement park in a lot of ways, because there's going to be so much stuff there that you grew up hearing about that was not reality until now.
Right.
And you're going to be so enthralled in it that you're going to tie yourself to it. So can you
Yeah.
get like break into detail some of the things that they're discussing doing?
Yeah. So yeah, it's exactly like you're saying. They call it like an urban concept planning. And it's where everything is within your 15-minute radius. So they advertise it being a walkability. So, you don't ever really have to leave the premise. The part they don't really tell you about is that you might not be able to leave it. It might essentially become a prison. And that's the part they really don't talk about, but that is very much a reality because it's happening in the UK right now. People are they're not able to leave those confines. And I think COVID was a really beta testing for that, right? We saw so many people who couldn't go within a certain distance from their home. We didn't have that so much in the United States, but certainly in Australia that was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And there were definitely other UK, I believe that was happening. I think
New Zealand.
New Zealand, exactly.
Yeah.
A lot of the commonwealths of the UK, which I don't think is a coincidence that that was happening in those areas, but
Yeah, Canada,
yep,
etc.
Canada,
Yeah.
exactly. So that and that uses that geofencing technology. So that's the part they really don't talk too much about. They talk more about the positives of how you're going to be, like you said, a fantasy land. Everything is within your walking distance, and you'll have all the shops and all the restaurants, and all the things that you would want are going to be right there, and you never have to leave. But the problem is that what if you want to leave? What if you want to go see somebody who is outside of this 15-minute radius? And how are people going to connect outside of these 15-minute radiuses? So, right, it's kind of like it's a way of I I I think it's a way of kind of leading you into the metaverse because you're now more restricted in your mobility, which is something they talk a lot about in the Agenda 2030 plan. They talk
Mm.
about the no crossing zones, and that's so the people will be restricted of having freedom of mobility, which is embedded in our constitution. I mean, that is a very, very like explicit laid out that we have freedom of movement and that we can travel across the country. That is laid out in the constitution. So this is a blatant violation of the constitution and a complete sublation of the constitution essentially. uh, but that
Well,
is what.
they found with
Mhm.
ESG, and this was part of the beta test of ESG, and what they were trying to put forward was
Right.
they were trying to subvert the Constitution. They were trying to find a loophole, a go around. If you can convince the corporations to be the militant arm and of your laws or of your regulations,
Mhm.
then it's not a government regulation. It is then it then becomes a cultural regulation, right?
Right.
And so this is why you see and somebody you need to get on your show that you'd really enjoy talking to is John Robb
Okay.
from and we'll talk about this off air.
Sure. That'd be great.
But he talks about the cluster, that hive mind that you see on social media, and
Mhm.
how like when somebody goes against the uh transgenderism or abortion or whatever cultural norms they are trying to force inside the Overton window that has completely shifted the paradigm of all of our lives, and you resist that, how they cluster and hive and attack you like white blood cells on a virus.
Right. Right.
And so they have figured out how to do that utilizing thought leaders, corporations,
Right.
financial institutions to keep you within the parameters of the geofencing model,
Yeah.
which they first started experimenting with in corporations through Microsoft delivering this into corporations. So what the corporations would then have you do is download an app to your
Mhm.
phone in which you keep track of the hours you work, the jobs you're doing, whatever. But what that
Right.
app's really doing is feeding on the information that's all over
Oh,
your
yeah.
phone and the places that you're traveling, the purchases that you're making, and it's
Right.
reading all the other apps that are on your phone, whether it's a bank app or your social media app or your
Right.
email app or whatever. And it's
Oh, yeah.
taking that information, feeding it then to your employers, and your employer can then make a decision whether or not you're up for a promotion, whether you need to be demoted, whether you need to be fired, whether you can be even be hired
Yeah.
for the job. And so they are taking that model from the corporations and they're instituting it into the city structure. And
Right.
this is where I had talked about a while back that they're looking at creating the city state into which the entire entity of the state then is infused around the city that
Hmm.
controls the supply chain and controls
Yep.
the trade and finance, and that those cities will then be the center hub for all political um, uh, discourse throughout the country, that the country will then be,
Well, also
adhered
resources,
to.
right? All the
Well,
resources are going to be
well, right.
confined to that locale. So you won't
Yeah.
be able to, if they decide they want to cut off your food supply and they can just tell you, oh, we couldn't get it into the city in time,
Right. They
where
want
we're
to make,
having.
but they want to make like Montana and North Dakota
Mhm.
adhere to the laws of California and New York,
Right.
because California and New York are the hubs in which they disperse food and resources. So
Right.
they're utilizing the resources as a tool to make you bow to your overlords.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, they want to make that a worldwide, so it's a global governance that
Right.
they're going to use as a locus. I did want to bring up because I have a friend who has family in the UK, and he was telling me that they were calling it like a traffic control system. That's kind of how they're selling it. But he is at
Like
the
Paris did, right? Then
yep,
wasn't
Paris
it
did the same
Paris
thing.
that you could only drive on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays if
Yes,
your license plate number ended in an odd number, and if it ended in an even number, you had Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday,
kind
and
of
then
like what Carter did. Remember with the gas lines,
mm,
right?
yeah,
Yeah. The very yeah, but he said that people are not buying it. They know that this is a control grid, that this is has nothing to do with traffic, and it really is. And then the other thing they call it is the climate lockdown. Um, but it's really all about control and restriction of mobility, restriction of movement. So yeah,
I wonder how that's going to things like that will affect the like tourists going to England. I know Beatrix is flying over there to see her mom and go to a
mhm.
concert in
Okay.
May. So
Oh wow.
I'm wondering if she's going to notice anything different about moving around in the city.
Yeah, I don't know. I know, I think this was, specifically Oxfordshire. Um,
Oh, okay. So it's just one general region.
yeah, I that doesn't mean that it's not happening in others. I'm not fully aware, but I know that that's specifically, what this was referencing. But I do believe London is doing similar things.
Wouldn't shock
So,
me.
yeah, no, that wouldn't surprise me at all. I would have to look further into what's going on in London to know for sure.
She actually, whenever she moved here from South Africa, she lived in London for a couple of years. And so when she moved to the US from South Africa, she thought it was strange that in Houston we didn't have CCTV everywhere at the time.
Really?
Yeah, she was like, "That's weird. Why don't they have this? They have it all over London. It's a good thing. It cuts down on crime, blah 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 blah." And slowly I chipped away at that. I was like, "Wait
Yeah.
a
Like,
minute."
let me inform you. Yeah. Um, no, I think that the one good thing though is that I think people are seeing through it. A lot of people are leaving, they're fleeing,
Mm,
they're trying to get out in time.
right.
So because I think they know that the goals are to keep them locked in. And so there a lot of people are leaving their places, whether they're selling them or abandoning them. And I think that while that's really unfortunate and devastating for the people there, I think it's also a sign that people are not buying the narrative and that they recognize that this is a major power grab and
Mhm.
that the consequences of what it could mean down the road are really, really, really bad.
That's one of the things I've brought up several times, and I always use Trump as the example. But whenever you're looking at the UK, you can use Brexit as the example.
Sure.
Like the election of Trump and the authorization of Brexit, that
Hmm.
the people voting to leave the European Union,
Right.
it really put the World Economic Forum in a strange position to where they
Hmm.
had no choice but to reveal their hand. They
Yeah.
had to show their hand at this
Sure.
time. And
That is true.
because they had to increase and accelerate in and take advantage of the small window of opportunity that they had left available to them.
Hmm. Yeah.
And that's the only reason that so many people know about all this stuff.
Oh yeah, I think that I think in some ways the COVID kind of backfired on them because
Mm,
it woke so many people up.
yeah.
Just because it really did show their hand, and there was just so much hypocrisy. I don't really think it was hypocrisy. I think that was just their way of showing that they're in power and they're in charge. And you have to do what they say, no matter whether it makes sense or not, even if they flip flop all over the place. But that was their way of
Yeah.
letting yeah, we call the shots. It doesn't matter if we said what we said yesterday, we contradict today. You follow what we say regardless.
Yeah.
But I think that from a just the average populace perspective, I think for them it's like, well, what's with all these contradictions? Nothing makes any sense. And it started the chain of people starting to dive into some of the research and look at what's really going on. So that was a silver lining, and I don't think they anticipated that. I think they thought that they had refined their trauma-based mind control tactics so well. And there was, we know what they call
I mean,
mass
yeah,
formation
I
psychosis.
still
And
see people
oh,
wearing masks sometimes,
oh,
so it's like
totally. I mean, they were successful. They were, but I don't think they counted on so many people resisting and so many people not falling under their spell. I
Mm,
think that's what they underestimated. I think they really thought that they had a grip on this and they were just going to be able to, there's just an analogy, but like, wave their wand and cast their spells, and people were just going to fall in line. And, as you just said, there were a lot of people who did, but I think there were a lot of people who didn't. And the number was a lot greater than what they expected. And I think that's kind of what's happening with these 15-minute cities. I do think that there are enough people, or maybe not enough, but I think there is a large group of people who are saying that this is not as sexy as it sounds,
right.
yeah, it's great to be able to live in a community where you can walk around, and that's the appeal of a city in general, right? Like, why do people
Mhm.
like New York City? Because they can roll out of bed and, go get their coffee downstairs and go get their whatever other vices they want is right at their fingertips. They don't have to go very far. And they can get I think people like also the feeling of having community without really being community. We've been, and this is part of the programming and conditioning, is that people don't have real communities anymore. They've
Right.
become very isolated. So I think people, in some sense, this is not all people, but I think the conditioning is such that a lot of people are actually afraid of intimacy. And so they don't want to be truly engaged in a real community. That would force them to be vulnerable, that would force them to take responsibility, both
Mhm.
personally and for others. And so they don't really want that, but they're still human beings and they still crave emotional connection and human interaction, and at least the perception of intimacy, or um, they want to find it on some level and some capacity. And cities give them the illusion of that because you're surrounded by people. You're forced to interact with people on a daily basis. But how how close are you to those people? How much can you rely on those people?
Mm.
In most cases, not very much. I mean, I lived in New York City for a long time, and I grew up right outside New York City. I lived in California, right in Santa Monica, Los Angeles, and most of the time, people don't know their neighbors. They barely say hello to each other. Even just walking down the street, you get strange looks if you smile or say hello, good morning, good afternoon. It was one of the big epiphanies I had when I moved to the South, that I felt like I was such a rude person because I've been so conditioned not to look at people in the eye and
Mm.
smile at them as you pass, because people would look at you like you're crazy if you did that in the city. And people in the South, it's very much the opposite. Everybody says, hello, good morning, good afternoon, how are
Right.
you? And,
Yeah.
and it's not like, you have to have a long conversation, but there's this, and it feels very genuine. I mean, I can't
Yeah.
speak for every person I pass, but for the most part, it doesn't feel like, it feels like it's just a genuine kind of like, hi, I'm greeting you.
Yeah.
And I felt like, wow, I'm such a rude person. This is so nice that people want to say hello and they
Yeah.
want to smile as you pass. But I think that we've been disconnected from that, and the purpose, that's part of the purpose of cities. And now they're intensifying that with these 15-minute cities where everybody's going to be, is going to be a hustle bustle and go go go, everything's at your fingertips, but there's no real connection, there's no real sense of community responsibility, and you're trapped. I think ultimately that's the plan. And you're
Yeah.
trapped, so you don't know what's going on outside of that bubble. Like you were talking about with the social media silos. And I think that's really what they're trying to drive towards this metaverse, because I think they're going to increase, like Disneyland. Disneyland has so much metaverse components, but you're trapped in your, I mean, you're not trapped, but you're in this, very insular environment. And I think that the big difference is the geofencing will trap people.
Yeah. I I've with something popped in my head when you're talking about that distrust of your neighbors and distrust
Mm,
of the people. Um, it made me think of a playground. When you have like a
mhm,
bunch of like children playing on a playground,
right.
they require parental supervision because they don't know how to participate in
Mhm,
involuntary activities in an unselfish manner and play games with rules, right?
mhm,
That they all agree on. And the parent is there to teach them the rules. And if you
mm,
grow up in an environment to where you can never trust that the person next to you is playing by the same rules and willing to participate under the same parameters that you were willing to participate under,
right,
then you turn to government to be that parental figure and to make sure that all the parameters are laid out in nice congruency. And
right.
so the cities, in some ways, make people feel more secure because they are being sheltered by that parental guidance.
Mhm.
They have that safety net that's offered to
Government
them.
is mommy and daddy. Yeah.
Exactly. Whereas if you live like in the situation I live in, right? I just
Mhm.
had to go spend $8,000 today on a mower. I
Wow.
just got informed that my an order of hatchlings got canceled. And so I have to go find new chicks. And I can't depend on a parent to do this. I'm
Right,
responsible for ensuring that the property I live on is taken care of. I am responsible for making sure that I am producing the eggs that I need to produce and have the chickens that I need to have in order to move forward in my plans going into the future. And I don't have that safety net. And I
right.
took upon that responsibility upon myself and I got rid of that parental figure in my
Yeah.
life.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because it also shows, and this is my experience actually. I mean, again, I don't want to make a blanket statement. There's exceptions to all the rules, but I do notice that people who have lived in cities their whole life, and even if they haven't, if they've been there for a very long time, there is kind of a stunting that happens. And I think really what you're explaining is a moral stunting. And I think this is a really fascinating. I mean, I've never thought about this before, so I'm really just thinking out
Mm,
loud. But I know that a lot of psychologists have determined that uh, you don't really have a strong moral intelligence until the age of 7. That's kind of when it's fully formed.
mm,
So prior to that, a lot of it comes from your teaching, you're learning. You're
mm.
learning to develop your understanding of right from wrong.
Yeah,
And
you're
that's not
being
to say
shaped. Yeah.
yeah, and that's not to say that you have no sense when you're 4 of what's right and wrong. Obviously, you have some, but it's not fully developed, from most of what the studies show until around the age of 7. And there are different stages. I think Jonathan Haidt had done a really good job of outlining, and he tested children at younger ages, their levels of what he called moral intelligence. And, there was variance even at younger ages. But it does seem like it's kind of formed at 7, but it's interesting to think about people living in cities having a stunted sense because they've had this false illusion of not having to take on that responsibility, the moral responsibility. And
Mhm.
what you're describing when you live in a more rural area, even just the interpersonal dynamics, because for survival reasons, we want to have good relations with our neighbors, even if they're very far away from us, because we may need to depend on them. We may need to be able to trade goods, services, or just have good relations so that they don't do harm to us, whatever that may mean. But harm to us, our environment, the children, loved ones. And whereas in cities, because you have that illusion of being protected by, the government and the artificial parameters, the concrete jungle in which you live, they don't have necessarily they haven't developed those skills, and they haven't developed that
Yeah.
adjudication and the interpersonal, from both the biological as well as a socio-psychological stance.
So I'm thinking about this geofencing in kind of like the way I would think about the Berlin Wall.
Yeah, I that's kind
So
of
so they
only it's
so
a
they
technological implementation, but yeah, I
right,
think it's a digital prison, but yeah.
right. It's like we're going to build these fences to keep
Mhm.
out the invaders, to
Right.
keep out the bad, those that would pollute and destroy our beautiful utopia.
Mhm.
And then in the process they change the dialogue and the narrative and saying, well, we keeping you in here for your own good because the
Always.
people out there are
It's for
going
your
to hurt
safety.
you. Right, exactly. And
Yeah.
so it's just that continuation of that paternal like mode of government.
Yeah, and I mean, we definitely see it in China. China, we know, is a technocratic model for what they want to roll out throughout the world. That's kind of their uh, exemplar. And
Mm,
in China, it's pretty extreme. They have these facial recognition technology. A number pops up. They use the social credit, and I think we're not impervious to these kind of measures and sanctions being implemented here. Certainly if they roll out the CBDCs, then that's going to be pretty easy for them to do. And if people opt into having chips implanted, and they actually really don't even need to be implanted, they have other technology and means of being able to do this type of tracking and tracing. And they also I mean, we do see it in the other countries. You have physical restrictions where there's a police type force that will come and security that will literally stop you
mm,
and put you in. I mean, we saw that in Australia during the last few years and then they got sent off to camps.
mhm.
And I think that is kind of the plan. Like you want to step out of these cities and then we'll put you off into these camps to teach people that this is what you don't do. So,
Yeah, it's I'm trying to figure out the way I want to say it.
mm,
It's there's this kind of a desire for security. Okay, so I remember a story I'd heard, that came out
Mhm.
of the Soviet Union.
Okay.
And the guy said, America in their capitalist system always brags about how free they are.
Right.
But when you go visit them, you see homeless people sleeping on the street.
Mhm.
In communist Russia, we have no such freedom,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
And so he's basically painting the freedom aspect of there being a homeless portion of society as being a negative, in that in communism, since the housing is always provided for you, you don't
Right.
have the freedom to be homeless. You're going to always have a place to stay,
Right.
right? And
Yeah.
so I kind of look at that as the way that they're viewing these cities. Like it's like,
Mhm.
yeah, like out in like the other day, I got home from work and I'm gonna move my baby ducks to another coop and I'm gonna put my baby chicks in the baby coop. And
Uh-huh.
so I get there and I open up the baby coop and there's a 6-foot rat snake in there that has eaten 2 of my ducks,
Uh-huh.
right? So
Oh,
so
geez.
in a virtual city, in a digital 15-minute city, you don't have the freedom to have to fight nature in order to survive.
Right. Um, which is it's a false illusion though, right? Because you're
Right.
not free, you're completely trapped. I wanted to also bring up that Trump is calling for these freedom cities. Have you heard this?
No.
Yeah, so it's interesting um because I think he's trying to appeal. It's like a as a trolling concept, it's pretty awesome, but in practicality, I think it's a little bit concerning because I think that it's essentially the same thing under a different branding, under a different name.
Like the Patriot Act. They wouldn't do that.
No. No, of course not. No. Um, but, uh, but some of the things that I think people should be aware of is that they're using the premise behind this is that it would be land that is owned by the government. That's a little bit interesting because
You will
first of
own
all, it's owned by
nothing
the
and you will be
government.
happy.
Why? What?
You will own nothing and you will be happy.
Yeah, so it's owned by the government. Why did the government own it? Why doesn't it become like eminent domain, or why don't they give it back to the people they probably took it from? Or but yeah, the government shouldn't be owning it. That's first of all. But second of all, if the government owns it, how is it going to be free since the government are the people who are im imposing the tyrannical
We
measures?
we are the government.
That was the idea. Right, right.
You don't know
Yeah,
how many people I've had say that to me in the last couple of years, and I'm like, how can you look at what's going on around you and still say that? Like,
right.
okay, if you
Yeah,
said that in
that was the
2019,
premise.
I'll give you a pass. But if you're saying that post 2020, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, yeah. It is supposed to be an experiment of self-governance. I would argue that we've somewhat failed because we've abdicated the responsibility of self-governing, and I think that really, to be fair, that a lot of the way that it's designed really doesn't lend itself to self-governance
You're right.
anyway. You know,
You're right.
it's I think there is a we could argue, I mean, it's a whole nother conversation, but I mean, we could argue that the way it was set up at the time when there was a much smaller country and people were much more regionalized and they didn't have the means to interact in such a wide scale capacity.
There was
Maybe,
self-segregation and
yeah,
yeah.
I even then, I think it was still problematic. I don't think it was 100% perfect, and I still think it lent itself to, being ruled by a few as opposed to a true self-governance, but I
Well, when
think
they brought in the Constitution, their argument was because the Articles of Confederation didn't give them enough power.
right. Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. I mean, I was much more in favor of the anti-federalists, but,
yeah,
again, that's a very different conversation. But I think that even so, one of the bigger problems is that individuals don't engage, and you alluded to this when you were talking about, the difference between somebody being in a more rural area versus in the city. People don't engage in self-governance. And I don't mean, like the way we think of it in terms of the civics. I actually mean just taking personal responsibility for your life, your family, your property. People really don't engage in much self-governance over their own person.
Yeah.
So that I think is where a lot needs to start.
I think we're coming close to an hour, and I don't
Mhm.
want to keep you too long, so I
Yeah.
want to start wrapping up. But I think you've made the point a couple of times that people are waking up,
Yeah,
and so that's a white pill that people can take away from this.
totally.
And what if we learned anything, no matter what you think about Jordan Peterson
Hmm.
and his personality, his personhood as an individual, what if we learned anything through his popularity is that
Right.
there is a great hunger amongst young men, especially
Yes,
for responsibility.
totally.
And as a man, I can speak on this a little bit because I understand it, right?
Right.
The way our psychology works, the way our mentality works,
Hmm.
it's not the act of doing
Right.
that is necessarily fulfilling.
Right.
It's the act of completing,
Right.
right? So when you can, let's say you like, I build a chicken coop, which I've
Hmm.
built several. So let's say I build a chicken coop or I build me a greenhouse, right? It is,
Hmm.
I do enjoy the process of building it. I don't,
Right.
I like woodworking. I think it's fun. I'm not exceptional at it, but I am good enough to where I can build a structure that will, that houses my chickens, or I can plant food in and it does its job.
Right.
But what's the most satisfying is after that's done and seeing that structure stand there and knowing that I did that and I took the responsibility to do this. And
Yeah.
I didn't contract it out to somebody else and depend on somebody else to do it
You
for
were
me.
self-sufficient.
Right. And my wife can give me a pat on the back and say, "Man, you did something I couldn't have done
Yeah,
without you." You know,
exactly.
and men are looking for that fulfillment of completing projects,
Yeah.
right? That the job well done is only it's not you're not rewarded for it until after it's done and you can look back and say, "That's why I did all that hard work."
Yeah.
Right? And so it would be it's the same in anything by taking these little actions and teaching yourself a small amount of delayed gratification on a
Mhm.
small scale, then you build yourself into an asset that is able to suffer for a long-term goal, which creates your entrepreneurs and podcasts. I mean, like, we didn't start podcasts and 2 days later we had like 5,000 views, right? You start
No.
a podcast and 10 people watch it and you're like, okay, 10 people heard me. And then the next time it's 40 people and you're like, oh, wow, I'm growing exponentially, and that's the way these things work.
Totally.
So there's this learning that gratification and wanting that responsibility on yourself
Mhm.
is
Right.
a very masculine trait.
Mhm. Yeah. No, I think that's very true. And that is a really interesting point about Jordan Peterson. I think that's very true. I think they could have a whole conversation about Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, there's plenty of
Yeah.
negatives about
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson, but if you learn one thing you saw with the audience growing and the way
No, it
that
was
the kids were
really
reacting, it was
spoke
like,
it spoke
interesting.
volumes that
Right,
young men in particular are really hungering for someone to lead them and for them to take personal responsibility.
right.
They needed to hear that message and they needed to know that that's what they're called to do.
Yeah,
And they're really what you could see that it was very palpable. And I think that's just innately biologically wired into men for sure.
right. Yeah,
And I think there is a similar counterpart for women. They need to know that they take responsibility so that they can be the nurturers, right?
yes,
If they don't learn to take a personal responsibility, they can't care for another being. So that's nuanced differences, and the biological differences are certainly there. But I think that's absolutely hardwired into humanity, and it's something that has been stripped from humanity, and much to our demise, for sure.
There's this speaking on women, like just to give like kudos, there's this
Mhm.
whole like trad wife kind of thing
Oh
trending right
yeah.
now, and I am exceptionally blessed with my wife. My wife is amazing. She works from home, and
Mm-hmm.
she handles 6 7 clients from home.
Wow.
And then at the end of the day, she spends probably 3 to 4 hours cooking.
Oh wow. Amazing.
And she's like old school. Like I bought her this really nice mortar and pestle. She crushing her own spices and like doing,
Uh
like she's just old school in that way. And I
yeah.
mean, I eat better than anybody else I know. There,
Uh
and
that's
it's
awesome.
rare, like on the rare occasion that she tells me I don't feel like cooking tonight. Then like last night she didn't feel like cooking. Fine. I'm Cajun. I can whip something up and it'll be spicy and good. So like what I did last night,
Mm.
I took a pot, boiled some shrimp with potatoes and corn and Vidalia
Oh,
onions, and we had boiled shrimp. It's
awesome.
like we'll figure it out. I can't believe neither of us are 300 pounds at this point. Waddling around
That's awesome. Well, you're
the
eating
way
real
we eat.
food, it sounds
We
like.
do
So
eat. Yeah,
that's
we
a
do.
huge part
We
of
do.
it. That really is. There is the it's a new term. It's called contamination obesity, and it really has to do with a lot of people don't know this, but uh, toxins are trapped in fat cells, and it's a protection mechanism so that it doesn't leach into the bloodstream. And so if you have a very high toxic burden, it can be really difficult to shed excess fat. And it's not necessarily a energy balance issue. It could really be a protective mechanism to shield the bloodstream and the organs from this toxic overload. And unfortunately, our society and our food industry, certainly the processed packaged food industry, there are lots of toxins and contamination. So that is a huge part of the problem.
You
Where
know
there was
you
an
know where I want to hear this conversation?
Mhm.
With Kyle Matovic on In Liberty and Health.
All
That's the
right.
guy to talk to with this.
Yeah.
Kyle, if you're listening, call Courtney, man.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I've talked to Kyle's awesome. And we should have a conversation about this, actually. I
Yeah,
think that would be a
that would
great
be
conversation.
perfect for his podcast
You
because
would
he
love
does a
it. Yeah.
lot of
Well,
stuff on that.
yeah, totally. So I'll reach out to him on that. But yeah, that's just
Yes.
a side note. But what was I gonna say though? Oh, I was gonna say I'm this weekend, Sunday, 4:45 Central Time, we're going to be live streaming The Right Voices. And it'll be Rachel Wilson, Jamie Hanshaw, uh, Aaron Aaron Joe Harris, and myself. And we're going to be doing a show on feminism. So I think that'll be pretty interesting for people. So tune in.
I've really become a fan of Rachel, man. I'm interviewing her next week. I'm really excited to have that
Oh,
talk.
awesome. Yeah, she's
Yeah.
awesome. She's going to come stay with us this weekend. So
Oh,
we can
nice.
shoot the show on Sunday. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I really enjoy listening to her.
Yeah. No, she's
So,
super sharp and she does really thorough research. And yeah, she's just awesome. So,
yeah, I got to finish her book before next Friday. So.
yes, you should.
So.
It's awesome.
It
She's
is good. It is
great.
good. I've read like 2 chapters of it. I just kind of it's been kind of on the side like
Right.
burner because I'm like I got to finish this. I got to finish this. I got is like there's so much other stuff going on, but yeah.
I get it. So.
Plug away, Miss Courtney.
Plug away. I'm the Courtenay Turner podcast. It's spelled like Courtenay. So that's COURTENAYTURNER.com. And that is where you can find most of my things, all the different social media platforms, all the different podcast platforms that I'm on. I have been taken down from YouTube, but I did start a new one at TCTP Truth Sleuths. I didn't want to put my name in, so I just put the initials of the podcast in there. And not every episode is up there, but I am now with a presence on YouTube, and I'm on most of the others. So Rockfin, Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, and then 20 audio platforms. And I have started a new Twitter since I have not gotten my old Twitter handle back yet. But I am at Kinetic Quartz on Twitter, Kinetic Quartz on Instagram, very active on both of those. And I'm on Telegram, the Courtenay Turner podcast channel. So I'm very active there as well. And yeah. And I'm going to be doing an event June 3rd and 4th. So definitely look that up. It's Rebels for Cause. And that stands for Creative Artists Uniting for the Sovereignty of Everyone. So we're kind of doing an Artist for Liberty type of event. And it's really centered around, we want to be the counterculture, but not, the artificially injected counterculture. Really genuine, organic. We have several speakers, musicians. We're looking for some comedians. I'll be doing aerial acrobatics. And it's just to inject the messaging of freedom, hope, truth seeking, and owning free will into the culture. So if you're in the Nashville area, go look that up. Yeah.
The aerial acrobatics. When I found you online, I went when I found you on Twitter, I went to your Twitter page and I saw that picture and I was like, that's not her. And then I was like, wait a minute, it is. And then I heard you on with Mark Claire, my buddy Mark, and you were talking about it. And I was like, oh my God. That makes me so nervous for you.
Yeah, it can be scary, but it's really fun. Yeah. And I'm not one of those performers who performs without a crash mat under me. I don't care if that's unprofessional. I think that should just be standard. Totally. So.
All right. Well, I appreciate it, Miss Courtenay. I always enjoy talking to you. And
likewise.
We are going to do many more of these.
Yes, please. Yes.
So I'm ending the recording.